5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and welcome to Omni at the Movies, where today we will be discussing Ultraman Rising, the latest entry in the Ultra series, and also one of the very small handful of American adaptations. Now, if you've been following the channel along since the first trailer dropped, you would know that I was skeptical about how this movie was going to go, because it didn't really look like it was going to be really capturing the essence of Ultraman. Looked more like it was going to be a generic, quippy superhero movie that just happened to have an Ultraman aesthetic to it. And it didn't look, it really didn't look like it was going to be properly representative of this really long-lasting series. And so I expressed that. When the second trailer dropped, it was better. It gave me hope that maybe there could be something salvageable, but I was still largely skeptical. I just didn't see how it was going to work out. But I was going to give it its day in court anyway. Well, that day has finally come. And I can say that while I wasn't entirely sure for a little bit, by the end, Ultraman Rising did in fact win me over. Before I get into the details, I would like to address something that I saw people bringing up as a potential defense of the movie before its release, regardless of if it turned out well or not. People were saying that, however it turns out, it could still serve as a good entry point for new Ultraman fans. Having watched the movie, I'm going to tell you right now, no, it's not. This is not where you want to start somebody on their Ultraman journey. It kind of acts on the assumption that at the very least you've seen the original 1966 Ultraman, and at the most you're familiar with the larger scope of the idea, but specifically that first series. It's not a sequel, mind you. It's set in its own continuity, but it is drawing the most from that original series. And as a result, it's also kind of expecting you to be familiar with it, which means it does nothing to try explaining the premise at all. Like, it just throws you into the world without any explanation, which, you know, there have been kaiju movies released up to this point. We've had Pacific Rim, we've had the Monsterverse, we've had Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, so people know it. They're not necessarily going to be that thrown by the idea of a world where giant monsters are suddenly appearing. But nothing is really done to explain where they come from, nor is there an explanation for Ultraman himself. Based purely on this movie, I don't think anyone would be able to tell if Ultraman is an alien, or a normal human being with powers, or what. Or if he is a normal human being with powers, where he got those powers from. Nothing like that is mentioned. And I understand that you don't want to get bogged down in the origin story, especially this far in where there have been so many superhero movies and everyone's sick of origin stories by now. But you know, Ultraman is new for a lot of people in America, where this movie made its big debut. So a little explanation probably wouldn't have hurt, but instead we don't have anything. There are only 2 things in the whole movie that kinda, sorta, maybe, but not really hint that Ultraman has an extraterrestrial origin. The first one being that Ken Sato's father, who is the original Ultraman, that's not really much of a spoiler, he tells Ken at one point that being married to Ken's mother showed him what it means to be human, which is a very weird thing for somebody to say unless they were an ET. But there's really nothing in the movie to suggest that the original Ultraman, the original Professor Sato, is from space. He just seems like a regular guy. And the other thing is technically a mid-credit stinger that therefore counts as a spoiler, so I can't really tell you, but let's just say it's more of an Easter egg than an actual clue about what all of the origins could be. And it's not going to make any sense at all to somebody who isn't familiar with Ultraman, especially not the deep lore. So, I mean, like I said, I understand not wanting to have to go through the same old origin story slog and just get to the more interesting story you want to tell. But a little bit more could have been nice. And as a result, no, I do not think this is where you want to start somebody new on their journey through the Ultra series. Fortunately, though, there are quite a few shows uploaded on YouTube officially that you can start with. Ultraman Blazar is a good one. Now, having said that, I do wish to remind you that I did wind up liking this movie, although I wasn't so sure I was going to at first. The main thing that was holding me back at the beginning was the main character, Ken Sato, the present Ultraman. He's an egotistical jerk in the first part of the movie, and there's just no getting around it. He's not even a charming egotistical jerk like the way Robert Downey Jr. played Tony Stark in the MCU. He's just, Ken Sato is just full of himself and very, very difficult to like. I actually wound up pausing the movie at one point to see a man about a horse, and I realized to my dread that we were halfway through the movie and Ken had not shown any sign of positive growth. And that had me worried about when I would come back and restart it. Fortunately, I had paused it right at the point where he does start to show positive growth. By shocking coincidence. And from there, things got better and better until finally he did get to a point where he was likable, and I could say, all right, I do like it now. I do sort of take umbrage with the fact that it took so long, but the important thing is that by the end, I was won over. So what about it works, actually? Well, starting on the superficial level, there are some great visuals here. The animation is top-notch. The character designs, I mean, like, they took a little bit of getting used to with certain things, like Naranga showing up and being fatter than he's ever been before, or Ultraman having a torso shaped like a Dorito. But once you adjust to it all, there's some really impressive stuff. Again, some stuff that only makes sense to somebody watching if they've already seen Ultraman. But even just on a regular level, there are some impressive visuals here. And I will also say, this is a story that benefits from being told in animation. Because if you were to tell it with practical effects, while it might have the familiar aesthetic, and I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but it would be way more difficult to do practically, and it just wouldn't work exactly the same. This needed to be animated, I think. And the animation itself is nice and slick and really works whether it's a more down-to-earth moment or it's a big action sequence. And there are also just some really great shots just on their own. I mean, some of my favorite shots actually come from the latter half of the movie, so I can't really get too deep into them without spoiling stuff. But rest assured, it is a very good-looking movie. But looks aren't everything, right? We have to go a bit deeper to figure out what really works and what makes it even better. I wonder if the timing of when this movie was released was intentional, because this is Father's Day weekend here in the good old USA, and Ultraman Rising is very heavily centered on the theme of fatherhood. That's the whole plot. Ken Sato, the current Ultraman, winds up becoming the parent of this baby kaiju that, as far as he knows, has been orphaned, and he has no choice but to raise it, because in this particular universe, Ultraman's job is not specifically to kill monsters, it's implied that he will if he has to, or at least I think it is, but more often he's described as saying he's supposed to maintain balance. So he tries to keep the kaiju alive whenever he can. And he's struggling to do that because he's basically on his own, other than having a floating orb with an AI in it that kind of helps but can only do so much. And at the same time, he's got to mend his relationship with his father, the original Ultraman, because they've become estranged for a very long time. And, well, fatherhood is key to this story. And I think it was explored pretty well. There's not like this... You know how there's this trend in Western entertainment where when men are depicted as trying to raise a baby on their own, they're always shown to be comically inept at it? Well, Ken is shown to be inept at first simply because he's unprepared and because, you know, it's a 20-foot tall baby that he's dealing with. But it's not because he is just not cut out for it. It's not because he's incompetent. He just has to learn to get past himself and put somebody else's needs before him, which is, again, a large part of his growth. It's right at the scene where he realizes he can actually form a bond with this baby kaiju, which is named Emmy eventually, that he does start to grow positively and become the father he's supposed to be to this thing. And by extension, that leads back to him mending his relationship with his father, which is not an instantaneous thing. It takes time, but it works. And that's very refreshing to see, I think. It's a nice way to sort of bring in a familiar plot that American audiences would be familiar with and apply it to Ultraman. Not that the Ultra series hasn't done this sort of thing before. There's actually an episode of Ultraman 80 I watched a few weeks ago that tells a similar story of a baby kaiju imprinting on the Ultra host, although it ends in a much darker way, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So that part works really well. And also, speaking of the infant kaiju Emmy, thankfully she is not an irritation. Baby characters of any size are very difficult to get right. And I think they managed to strike the right balance with Emmy, where she's obviously more than a handful and does drain Ken of his energy quite a bit, but she's not a nuisance, and she's got enough adorable traits about her that she feels like a real baby, basically. If a real baby was huge and could shoot lasers, that would be Emmy. It feels like maybe the people who wrote this thing were drawing from personal experience. I would not be the least bit surprised. There's also a lot of emotion towards the end. As we see Ken growing, as we see his relationships building and mending, and everything is moving in the directions they're supposed to, you know, that it really starts to tug at the heartstrings quite significantly. Not in a manipulative way, I don't think. It feels natural. And that emotion is part of what won me over, because it felt genuine. I cared about what was going to happen. If something did happen to Emmy, and something does at one point that's actually kind of surprising that they even did it, but it hits. It hits really hard when that happens. And seeing how it affects everything moving forward, like, they managed to pull that off. I am impressed with that. They really did manage to make a very heartfelt entry in the Ultra series. So, kudos to them for that. Now, is there anything that I didn't like other than the fact that Ken was so unlikable for half of the movie? Yeah, there are things I think could have been done a little bit better. For starters, the villain, Dr. Onda. He's a little undercooked. Like, they try to make him sympathetic. Like, he's not truly evil, but because of stuff that happened to him, because of his backstory, he is on the wrong path, and he's in it so far that he is willing to, in fact, give his own life, if that's what it takes, to accomplish his mission of destroying kaiju. But we don't really see enough of him for it to really land the way it was intended. The way it kind of feels at this point is like they had a guy who just wanted to have the generic idea of he wants to kill monsters, and we don't necessarily want to kill monsters in this universe, so that's wrong. But we got to make him a bit more complex than that, so here's the tragic backstory. And it just didn't land for me. I feel like either he needed to be just a full-on, straight-up supervillain with no remorse and just is mustache-twirlingly evil, or he needed to be in the movie more and perhaps actually have more of an interaction with the Sato family to make the stakes a bit more personal. Not that they aren't personal at the end, but he's so far removed from the primary plot most of the time that I just don't think he was one of the more memorable villains here. There's also the fact that sometimes the writing feels like it needs to explain everything up front. This is especially the case whenever Omni is on screen. That's Omni the journalist, not Emmy the giant monster baby. Omni has this tendency of whenever she's interacting with Ken to just exposit, specifically about him. There are multiple scenes where it just feels like she's reading his character bio to him. And that was unnecessary. We could watch this unfold on its own and see naturally what was going on. I don't know why they felt like they had to have this exposition here, other than it gives Ami a little bit more to do in the plot, because otherwise she doesn't really have that much to do. Then we have the fact that there's a massive plot hole in this movie, which does kind of have an effect because the entire impetus of the story happens because of it. So there's this ongoing subplot about Kaiju Island, not to be confused with Monster Island. It's a place that everybody talks about like they know it exists for certain, but nobody knows where it is. For some reason, even in this setting with super advanced technology, where kaiju are supposedly coming from this island on a regular basis, nobody has been able to find where it is. Now, the whole reason that Emmy's egg, because it starts off as an egg, was brought to Japan in the first place by the Kaiju Defense Force, or KDF for short, is because they wanted her to hatch, and when she hatches, they were hoping that she would use her natural inborn homing instincts to eventually go back home, which they're supposing is Kaiju Island. So that raises the question of where did they get the egg? Think about it. They don't know where the island is, but they're expecting the baby that hatches from this kaiju egg to lead them to the island, which means she must know where the island is just instinctively because that's where she comes from. So they found the island, got the egg, and brought it back to Japan so that it could hatch and the infant would lead them to the island that they don't know the location of? I can't reconcile that one. I'm sorry. It makes no sense. Unless the mother, Gigantron, somehow, for some reason, lays eggs on a completely different island or just another location entirely. But even then, that still wouldn't make sense, because why would Gigantron lay an egg on a different island as opposed to the island she lives on? And how would the baby know to get there? It really doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. Speaking of Gigantron, I actually do like her as a kaiju. At first I wasn't so sure about the choice to have the design be just a generic-looking Western dragon, but it actually does work quite well. They do some interesting stuff with her, and she winds up being very sympathetic in the context of the plot. I don't know about the name. The name sounds more like it belongs to a robot than an organic living creature. But what can you do? I'm not in charge of naming. So, Ultraman Rising, I suppose, isn't perfect. It's definitely not for newcomers. But if you're a longtime Ultraman fan, and you can brace yourself for not liking the main character for a good chunk of time at first, I think you're going to be in for a treat. It is a good movie. Maybe not perfect, but I do think it's worth a watch, especially if you're a fan. And that's where I stand at the moment. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.